Welcome. On behalf of NIOSH-supported education and research centers throughout the country, we are pleased to present the 2019 Ergonomics webinar series, offering free monthly webinars on various topics on human factors and ergonomics. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today's webinar, Leg and Neck Muscle Fatigue, Physiological Mechanisms that can lead to Musculoskeletal Disorder, is brought to you by the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and Dr. Bernard Martin. Few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online chat or Q&A. We will save time at the end of the presentation to address questions. This webinar will be recorded and archived for viewing on COEH Northern California's YouTube channel. At this time, I'm pleased to welcome our presenter, Dr. Bernard Martin. Bernard Martin is an Associate Professor of Industrial and Operations Engineering at the University of Michigan, where he teaches courses in biomechanics, man-machine interactions, and research methods in ergonomics. Dr. Martin is interested in human sensory motor control systems and performs research in this area. His current areas of investigation include sensory and motor assessments of mild stroke patients for adaptation of rehabilitation procedures, muscle fatigue and standing work, upper trapezius myalgia and muscle fatigue, contribution of cutaneous proprioception to posture control, and human vibration. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Martin.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm very happy to be presenting some of my results today. And I've illustrated on the first slide the two of the typical work situations that we may be facing. Most of the time, it's either working in a standing posture, and you see that the type of job that is performed here is quite fatiguing. And then the other one is remaining seated for long hours at a workstation to do office work. But I have to say, these are just illustrations of the multiple tasks that are to be performed either sitting or standing, where we are submitted to very prolonged exposure. So all these type of activities may lead to muscle fatigue. One thing that you may realize is that humans are not made to work. We are not designed to work. We have been condemned to work. One guy once in a lifetime ate an apple, and then we were condemned to do some work. So what I'm going to show you first is a quick definition of fatigue. Fatigue is viewed by different people in different ways, and more recently somebody said that it could be a brain-derived emotion that regulates exercise behavior to ensure the protection of the whole body homeostasis. And to some extent it's true, fatigue is a protective mechanism. However, it is protective as long as we can perceive it. And then I will show you that in some instances, some fatigue may not be perceived. The most common definition of fatigue that you may be familiar with is this decreased capacity to produce force. And so behind that, we have to pay attention is that fatigue is not a monomechanism phenomenon. So in fact, we could say that the word fatigue may also be viewed as the tree that hide the forest behind it. And I'm going to show you some mechanism of fatigue, mention them, and you see that they are quite numerous. So in fatigue, we may have a central fatigue, the one that comes from the brain, so to speak, is that where we, when we are fatigued by just thinking too much, we may also have a decrease in our capacity to produce muscular effort. And then there is the most common type of fatigue that we may be submitted to resulting from physical work is peripheral fatigue. And so there are different mechanisms in this peripheral fatigue. Some mechanisms you may be very familiar to, such as the accumulation of lactic acid, like in marathon runner. Effectively, there is a high buildup of lactic acid that would interfere with the calcium ion that would reduce the capacity of the produce force with the muscle. So this is mostly heavy muscle type of effort. And then there are some physiological changes reflecting the imbalance between the muscular demand and the vascular supply. Is that whatever the muscle do, it needs the fuel to produce this muscle contraction, And when the muscle contraction demand more than what the vascular system can supply, we have a limitation which is ending into fatigue. And then there is also that metabolic issue, such as the reduction of oxygen and nutrient when in some circumstances, such as long static muscle contraction, the blood flow may be suppressed to the muscle. So then we have a reduction of the distribution of oxygen. We have a reduction of the nutrient. And so this will lead to a reduction of the capacity of the muscle. And then there are these electrical signals that are, you know that our nervous system is working with electrical impulses. And so what we call this action potential that propagate along the nerve fiber and along the muscle fibers as well are the one generating the action and triggering the muscle contraction. And so some of these action potentials sometimes may fail to propagate from the nerve to the muscle, which is also reducing the muscle capacity to muscle force. And then a last one that I will mention here in this peripheral mechanism is this excitation contraction failure. So in fact, the action potential may be jumping to the muscle, but when it's in the muscle, then it doesn't sort of progress inside the muscle to free all the calcium that is necessary in order to activate all the muscle fibers and to form all the cross bridges that produce the muscle contraction. So that's another mechanism. So you see, there is a number of mechanisms here, and we're going to see that these mechanisms are not independent on the way in which we want to contract the muscle. There is another type of fatigue that you have seen before, or some of you have seen before, which is the mechanical fatigue that is due to the wear and tears of the tissue due to repetitive mechanical stress. And my colleague Shane Gallagher has been presenting that webinar a couple of weeks ago. And then there is something that we have to pay attention to is that if we work, we get fatigue, but if we don't work, we don't get fatigue, but the muscle injuries still appear. So in fact, there is what is called the necessary fatigue, and that's work especially of Karen Shogar and Gisela Shogar in Denmark, who have demonstrated in their recent theory that in fact, in order to prevent muscle atrophy, to reduce pain and reduce disorder, we have to have a certain amount of fatigue. We have to develop a certain amount of fatigue. The role of the ergonomist is to decide where is the trade-off, what is enough, what is not enough. We don't want to be couch potato. We don't want to work too hard. If we don't work enough, we get injured. If we work too hard, we get injured. And so, as I said a moment ago, all the mechanisms of fatigue are muscle activity dependent. So depending upon whether we have a high level contraction, we have low level contraction, sustained, intermittent or repetitive, or whether we need accurate control of the muscle contraction, all these different types of activity will involve more than one muscle fatigue phenomenon. And that's where the difficulty is finding out what is the reasonable amount of fatigue, but what are the mechanisms that are underlying the fatigue that we observe in order to design possible intervention. And that's what my work has been, is finding what are the mechanisms, what is the consequence of fatigue, as fatigue is considered by a lot of people as a precursor of musculoskeletal disorder, in order to design effective intervention. And so in order to assess fatigue properly, we need to use a method that is sensitive to this mechanism. And in the presentation I'm going to have today, I will focus on one of the methods that we used that is very sensitive to this long duration fatigue, is that when we produce muscle contraction, there is some fatigue that disappears very quickly, some fatigue phenomena that disappear very quickly, and some fatigue phenomena that persist a long time. And so we have used a method called the muscle twitch force that is very sensitive to this quantification of the prolonged fatigue, and that is also sensitive to the muscle contraction that we can observe in prolonged standing or prolonged sitting. So in prolonged standing, it would be mostly the leg muscle. In prolonged sitting, it would be essentially the neck muscle because we don't move too much our head. And so this method is appropriate to quantify the fatigue developed by these two types of sustained long duration muscle activity of low level. So the problem is always these two faces of Janus. Is where does the problem come from? What is leading to what? And here I've illustrated that by two of my favorite animals in the farm that we have, that my family has in France. The dog here is called Sam, and the horse is called Fifi. And in the morning when I wake up, I tell Sam, because Sam sleep in the house, I tell Sam, please go to walk Fifi because I don't have time now. And then I get up, I take my breakfast and I go to the barn and I talk to Fifi and I say, Fifi, Sam is coming to you, I told him to walk you, but I don't know whether Sam is really doing his job properly. So please, when Sam is coming, go walk the dog. And as you can see on this illustration, you see that there is a link between the two, that there is a chain. And if you look at the picture, it's very difficult to understand who is leading who. And that's the issue of fatigue, is what is leading to what. So let's start with standing work. Standing work is something that is extremely common. A lot of people are in industry, in manufacturing especially, you see a lot of people working in standing situation, and there are the work session all day long. And there are other people that are working in other type of area that are also standing all day long. Unfortunately, for us, we are not equipped to stand for a very long period of time. It's like horses, as you may know, they can lock their joint and maintain the standing posture without exerting any muscle activity. And it's very well known that horses can even sleep while standing. Once they lock their joint, they can fall asleep. And then we have other animals such as the kangaroo here that has a tail and that can use another support to maintain the balance, so exert less muscle activity in the leg in order to maintain that standing posture. So unfortunately for us, we are neither horses nor kangaroos. And sometimes I think that engineers designing the workplace may think that we are horses or kangaroos. So the alternative to standing work would be seated work. However, as illustrated here, some jobs cannot be, I mean, if you know that game, bocce, you know that you cannot play bocces while seated. And there are plenty of jobs in industry that cannot be performed while seated. And I would say seated has also been called the new smoking, is that seated is not acceptable. When people sit too long, they have exactly the same problem as people that are standing too long. Is that people sitting too long complain, or standing too long complain about low back pain, they complain about neck pain, they complain about edema. So it means that neither of these is a good alternative. And so what we are trying to do is find out what could be other possible alternatives. So in fact, you can ask other people to perform the job, which I recommend to you. However, if you ask somebody to do the job, then you don't work enough, and then you will not fatigue enough, and then will get injured. So the alternative would be, well, can we try to change the work duration? I don't think when you ask management if they want to reduce the work duration, they're not going to say yes. And as I said, if we don't work enough, we're going to get injured anyway. So some people have thought about anti-fatigue mats, and some people have claimed that they were able to reduce muscle fatigue, and we're going to see whether they do that or not. And then other people have said, well, we could use that principle, but instead of using mat, we could use shoe insoles or shoes to reduce muscle fatigue. Or some people have also proposed to change the work cycle, is that if we have a shorter work period separated by a short rest period, that could be beneficial to the muscle. And as I said, we may try to work in another posture than standing, but it may not be the good solution. The issue is that in standing, we are exerting very low level muscle activity. And this low level muscle activity, despite the fact that it's very low, but this sustained, lead to muscle fatigue. This has been demonstrated. And as I said before, muscle fatigue, even for level of muscle contraction that are less than 5% MVC, may last a very long time. And the accumulation of muscle fatigue has been assumed to be a precursor of musculoskeletal disorder, because it may accumulate over days. But if we don't use the appropriate method to quantify the fatigue, we may not see that. And there are plenty of methods that have been used to quantify muscle fatigue that were not taking into account the fact that there is one muscle fatigue phenomenon that lasts a long time, and fatigue may still be there at the end of the day and maybe the day after. So what we did was to sort of simulate work situation requiring standing work, and in which the person are like at the conveyor belt where they have a workstation, they don't move from there. And we did that using a different group of people. So we had the young, and we had the male and the female. We had the older participant with the young and the old participant, and of both gender. And of course, we adjusted the workstation to the size of the participant. And what we did was to measure, quantify fatigue before, during, and after work. And so we had these various conditions as well, where people were standing on the floor, not doing any type of activity by resting mostly, or walking on a treadmill. We combined, well, we tested age and gender, and we tested the work cycle, and we tested a lot of different work cycles that I will present one at a time. So the method that we use to quantify fatigue is the muscle twitch force. And you can see here, if I can activate my videos, that what we do is we are very bad. In our lab, we like to zap people. So we apply an electrical stimulation that is not very painful. It's discomfortable, but not really painful. And that electrical stimulation will induce a muscle contraction. And here you see that in an isometric condition where the foot is resting on a force transducer. But here we remove the force transducer, and you see the motion of the feet. So in fact, we apply that electrical stimulation to the leg muscle, and we produce a plantar flexion, or what is also called ankle extension. And we measure the force here that is produced on the force sensor. And here we display the twitch force profile as a function of time. So you see that there is an increase in the twitch force and then a relaxation. And so we measure the amplitude of the twitch force as well as the sum of the contraction time and relaxation time. So we measure the duration and the amplitude of the twitch force. And we measure that by applying electrical stimulation at low frequency 2 times per second. We measure this over a number of stimulations to get an average. And we do that measure 4 times a day. And we have a bunch of subjects, always more than 15 men and women. We have 2 age groups, 18 to 30 and 50 to 65 years old. And you see that in between 30 and 50, we don't consider people neither too young nor too old. So we always eliminate them. So I don't know if people are studying the 30 years old, the 40 years old population, whether they would have the same effect. But that's usually what is used to understand the effect of age on any type of risk on health issues. The procedure, as I said, we measure the muscle twitch force. We also had some measure of the center of pressure, the hemoglobin, the volume of the leg, the force, the control of force, and the stability of force exertion. But I'm going to focus today only on the muscle twitch force as a measure of muscle fatigue. And so we, of course, have a control day in which people don't do anything. And then in our experimental task, we ask people to simulate a standing work task without loading the upper extremities, to not have this factor to take into account, because if you are lifting and standing at the same time, that could be also a confounding factor. So they do, either they play chess, they play cards, they do their computer work, whatever they want, as long as it's a very light activity. And we require them, when they come to the lab, not to have done a very heavy type of exercise before they come to the lab. And then we asked them to be submitted to different work and rest cycles. So they work for X minutes and rest for so many minutes. And the rest are always in the sitting posture and the work in the standing posture. And of course, they have always a lunch break. And then we test them immediately after work, but also 30 minutes after work and 60 minutes after the end of work. So we tested overall all these 5 work rest cycles. So we have long period of work followed by a long period of rest here, or short period of work followed by this short period of rest. And immediately you can understand that if you are in industry, usually this type of work cycle may not be very well appreciated. People prefer to have a long period of work and a shorter and a longer period of rest, and having an interruption every 20 minutes, so to speak, because they prefer to have a longer rest. So, but we tested that anyway to determine whether there was a significant influence and whether in some situation it was possible to implement that type of work rest cycle. So here are the first result when somebody is standing on the hardwood floor, and here we have representing on the vertical axis the muscle twitch force in percent. So 100% is our control value obtained in the morning. So in the morning, that's our reference baseline. And then the value are expressed then in percent of that 100%. So whenever the number decreases here, it means that the twitch force is decreasing, meaning that there is fatigue. And so this is as a function of time. So the measures are taken in the morning, at lunch, early, immediately after their work task, and the work task is 5 hours. So in all of these type of tests, we keep the subject about 7 to 8 hours in the lab, and the work period is always 5 hours. So whatever we redistribute in terms of work as rest is always the same total amount of work that is performed, in order not to claim that differences could be due to a difference in the amount of work. It's always exactly the same. And here the curves are showing for male and female. And what we see is that at lunchtime, in that particular case for this work cycle, 15 minutes work, 5 minutes rest, at lunchtime, we have very little effect, but immediately after, we have a fatigue, and 1 hour later here, the fatigue has remained exactly the same. So for both male and female, and for both old people and young people. And we didn't find a significant difference of age. We didn't find a significant difference by gender. And then of course, we have to compare that with the control day. So here I'm just pointing you to the red line. Here is the muscle twitch force in the gastrocnemius soleus muscles when the person are not doing anything here. And so we have that also in the tibialis anterior, and you see that there is no difference between the morning and the end of the day, meaning that when people are just resting, most of the time they were seated, and once in a while they were walking, either to go for lunch, to go to the bathroom, or do something they wanted to do, but they were seated probably between 85 and 90% of the time. We see that in that particular case, there is no fatigue in the leg muscles. Then we also asked them about their perception of fatigue at the beginning and at the end. And what we see is that effectively the perception of fatigue may be increasing during the day for both the young and the old persons. However, at the end of the day, 1 hour or even, it's even half an hour later, after the end of the workday, they perceive fatigue. Half an hour later, there is no significant difference between the beginning and the end of the day, meaning that the perception of fatigue has disappeared. And so this is the first demonstration that effectively, as I just showed you a moment ago, at the end of the day here, there is fatigue, and it persists an hour after, and maybe longer. We didn't measure that because it takes too much time, but the fatigue perception has disappeared, while the fatigue, objective measure of fatigue is still indicating that there is fatigue. So what we observed, and I will mention in a moment, is that there was no significant difference either between the work cycle. I will come back to that point in a moment again. So then we try to combine the comparison between standing on the hardwood floor, standing on a floor mat that is supposed to be called the anti-fatigue mat, which is one of the biggest scam in the ergonomic era, and then this foot sole, and I'm going to show you here the result is that when we compare the fatigue due to these three types of condition using exactly the same work and rest cycle, what we observe is exactly the same thing. So it's like fog and snow, is that you cannot distinguish too much. And so no noticeable cycle effect, no age or no gender effect, no mat, no sole effect. However, I have to say that if the mat are not doing anything, it shouldn't be a reason to remove that mat from the worker. Is that people standing on a mat may like to stand on it. They think that they are better off on the mat than on a hardwood floor. And in terms of subjective perception, it's a benefit. So don't get me wrong, I would say the mat may have a benefit from a subjective point of view. From the physiological point of view, it doesn't do anything. So if you use a mat, it shouldn't be the only intervention type. That's what it means. Or if you use a sole insert and the sole effect are less than the mat effect in terms of perception, if you use one of these interventions, it should be accompanied by something else and not just by this, because they don't do anything from the physiological point of view. So in the first conclusion is that there is effectively a fatigue of long duration. It lasts a very long time and is definitely not perceived. In neither of these situations, we had an indication of perception of fatigue after half an hour or an hour of work. The fatigue is not influenced by age or gender when resulting from low-level mean exertion. And make sure that you understand that issue important, is that gender and age effect have been found in other type of muscle contraction. So in heavy lifting, for example, you see an age effect. You can see also a gender effect. And other type of muscle contraction that are a higher level, you may see an age and a gender effect. But here, in terms of low-level exertion, sustained exertion, we didn't see that. So meaning that older people or female may not be more susceptible than the young population or the male. Then we demonstrated that also the anti-fatigue mats are not efficient and neither are the sole inserts. And in fact, what is the master word here, the major point here is that fatigue may last a long time post-work. And so earlier studies that have only investigated 2 hours of standing and using a subjective evaluation of fatigue said that there was muscle fatigue, but they didn't quantify that muscle fatigue after a long period of time. In real work simulation. So then we did another type of study that we call study number 3, where we had participants, male and female, young and well, here in that case, we had only young people because we knew that there was no age effect, but because of the ethic requirement, we had male and female. And we compared the hard floor and we said, well, let's verify another mat. And then let's see when people are, instead of standing, whether if they are walking, what could be the effect if they are walking on a treadmill. And we used exactly the same type of protocol, the same type of measure. So here is just an illustration of the protocol with work and rest cycle distributed during the day with different type of work activities during the day that are very light end activities. And we measure the amplitude and the duration of the muscle twitch force. And so here the graphs are comparing, on the left, the graph is comparing the muscle twitch amplitude. On the right, the graph is comparing the muscle twitch duration for these three conditions: the mat, the hardwood floor, and walk on the treadmill. And we see that there is no difference between the mat and the hardwood floor. Is that at lunchtime, there is a sort of indication that there will be some fatigue, but it's not statistically significant here. And also for the duration, we see an increase in the duration, meaning that there is an indication of fatigue, but at that level, there could be an interaction between what is called potentiation and muscle fatigue. Is that they are fighting, each mechanism is fighting the other. Potentiation is something that happens to the muscle when you warm up. The more you warm up the muscle, the more force you can get out of that muscle. And you certainly know that athletes do warm up before a competition because they need to sort of exert their muscle, so then they get a higher force. And so this is where the two mechanisms may be confounding or counteracting each other. Then at the end of the work, we observe that in the evening immediately after work, we see a very significant effect of fatigue, both for the twitch duration that is reduced and the twitch amplitude that is also, the twitch duration is increased and the twitch amplitude is decreased. And the fatigue continues, and you see that in fact here, you see that there is a little decline in the twitch magnitude, may not be statistically significant in terms of amplitude, but when we look at the duration, we see that fatigue continues to progress. Is that even though the work has stopped, the fatigue phenomena may continue to progress after we rest. And that's what also a very important issue here is that fatigue may still continue to progress despite the fact that here people are completely resting. So then when we compare to the walking, what we observe is effectively more specifically, that potentiation effect is that people are walking, so we see an increase in the muscle twitch force due to this warming of the muscle. But then as the day progresses, we see that at the end of the day, there is a decline relative to that potentiation. There is a decline, and that decline continues. That fatigue continues to progress after work. And here also, when the duration, we see that there is a continuation of the fatigue after work. And after 1 hour, even though people are resting, there is fatigue. However, what we see is that there is a benefit of walking, is that the difference of the fatigue at the end of the day is quite obvious, is that there is much less fatigue due to walking than just remaining standing all day long in a mostly static posture. And when we say mostly static, is that in fact when the worker at their workstation standing, they can move around, but they are limited in space. Usually it's 1.5 meter by 1.5 meter, so they cannot go very far, so they cannot walk too much. They cannot exercise too much. And so here we illustrate that there could be a benefit of walking versus standing, meaning having an active type of muscle contraction. So what, in conclusion for this study, is there is an alteration of the muscle twitch force that is present over so many minutes of the workday. Here, 320 minutes, which is almost 5 hours of work, and hard floor and anti-fatigue floor mat didn't do too much, so the fatigue is about the same for both, despite the fact that people may claim that they feel a little bit better on the anti-fatigue mat. Physiologically, they are in the same condition anyway. These alterations were not so evident only after an hour, almost 2 hours of work, standing work. However, here we had a combined issue of fatigue and potentiation, and so fatigue was probably present, but not that conspicuous. So maybe in terms of time duration, probably 2 hours of standing could be an acceptable total amount of time that could be tolerated for a workday. And then slow pace working had a beneficial effect because it attenuated the effect of fatigue. So these dynamic contraction were certainly a benefit. And so it appears here that the fatigue may be better mitigated by dynamic activity than just by a rubber mat or a sole insert, so to speak. So in terms of intervention, this is saying, well, we have to be active. We have to combat these phenomena that are induced by this static muscle contraction and understanding the long-lasting effect of these phenomena. So then we tested the shorter work cycles. Here they are represented. And here again, we have the very short work cycle and the longer work cycle. And of course, always the same total amount of work that we submit the worker to. We just redistribute as before the period of rest. And what we observed here in terms of result is that the muscle twitch force and muscle twitch duration for these 3 cycles are difficult to distinguish, meaning that at lunchtime and immediately after work and 1 hour after work, we have effectively this very pronounced muscle fatigue, regardless of the work cycle. And this is confirming that fatigue is also continuing to progress even an hour later. However, I have to say that when we did some comparison with some subjects, with some participants, for a few of them, we observed that there was a benefit of a shorter work cycle with rest break coming closer. And so it was not for all, because these are the averages, but there could be a benefit for some people, but not for everybody. And so that's why here you see that the muscle twitch force here may be still declining, but some people may have a benefit of the work cycle. But because it's not happening to everybody, it's very difficult to say that this should be a measure that has to apply to everyone. We have to be very careful about that. Some may not. And then in the last experiment about the standing, we did a stand, walk, and sit. And again, we had 2 work cycles, and we used the same quantification, the twitch amplitude and the twitch duration. And we have 2 rotation of stand, walk, and sit in the same order. So here you have standing for 90 minutes, rest, here a rest period, and then walking, the lunch break, and then sitting. And then you have standing with rest breaks. And then sitting, you have standing, walking, and sitting, and you have standing, walking, sitting. So we sort of have the same sequence, but in different distribution. And what we observe is that both situation, both rotation, were inducing the same amount of fatigue here. However, what we observed is very important, is what's happening here. Is that an hour later, after either of these cycles, we see a recovery. In fact, what we see here is that there is fatigue immediately after, and then what we see is that an hour after, half an hour later, and an hour later, we had a progressive recovery, that the twitch amplitude going back to its initial level. And the same thing for the duration, is that the duration would increase and then decrease again, being reduced, meaning that there is a recovery. So in fact, what is the conclusion is that when we have this work cycle, this rotation, there was not much difference, but in this situation where we alternate between standing, walking, and sitting, we have a benefit in terms of recovery, meaning that if the fatigue is developing during the day because of this rotation between the 3 type of condition, we have a better recovery, meaning that at the end of the day, people will recover faster and probably may have less muscle fatigue the day after. So in terms of mechanism, where do these things come from? What I would insist on is that definitely it's the failure of excitation contraction coupling that is the mechanism associated with long-lasting fatigue effect. And this may be due to a little girl that you have heard of called Cinderella. And you have heard about Cinderella, who is that little girl starting to work early in the morning and working very late at night and not stopping. And that's what is also happening to the muscle fibers, is that some muscle fibers are activated as you start working, they are activated and they continue to work as you recruit more muscle fiber, they continue to work all day long. And so by the end of the day, they are the ones that are going to produce that fatigue and that are going to contribute the most to this fatigue effect. And so when and I will show you that in the next step of study, is that when we try to disrupt this Cinderella effect by asking people to walk, to control their muscle contraction in a different way, instead of being monotonous, we ask them to perform some exercise such as walking, we discovered that there is a reduction of muscle fatigue, meaning that probably we can disrupt the way in which Cinderella is working. Of course, in terms of central fatigue, there is certainly a central component of fatigue because people are working all day long. We cannot deny that. But here, what we were testing is that central fatigue mechanism was not tested because what we did was to stimulate the muscle. So in fact, we eliminated that confounding factor. We tested only what was happening at the muscle level. So in fact, we tested what is happening at the periphery, the peripheral fatigue. So in a nutshell, what I could say is that if sitting is not an option, neither is standing, especially when you're standing in front of a bear and a deer and you're sitting on the road, you better walk away very quickly. Not because of the deer, but because of the bear. So now let's talk about the pain in the neck, another type of static situation in which a lot of people are working. Worker, of course, this poor guy, Atlas, had to support the whole world, so he could complain about neck pain. And then you had people at the screen all day long at their workstation. You have the surgeon bending their neck all day long, and a lot of surgeons are known to have this trapezius myalgia. Dentists and also assistant to dentist operator that are bending all day long to watch what's happening in your mouth. People in industry assembling things, bending, and even kids now using this type of computer or even phone. And then of course, a contortionist may also complain about the pain in the neck. Recently, somebody asked me, so well, what would you recommend as a workstation if people want to work in their bed? I said, I wouldn't recommend to work in bed either. It's a pretty bad situation. People will still complain about neck pain, back pain, and other type of issues. Anyway, so what the method? We again use electrical stimulation where we stimulate the muscle and measure the twitch contraction. But I'm going to emphasize more on the EMG activity to show more about the mechanism, about what the muscle is doing during this static contraction. And what we observe here, we had a control day and an intervention day. In the control day, people perform different activities. In the intervention, they do the same type of activities, but once in a while, we come to disrupt them with some special task, and we tell them jokes. We engage in conversation. We have to put their feet on the desk. We have to shrug their shoulder and put some effort. Or we are trying to distract them in any which way we can, except insulting them in order to change their posture. And so here is the list. So I'm not going to go over that list. I will come to the result. What we measure was the EMG activity using this 2D array of electrode, which is the top of the line type of methodology that has been created very recently. And what we measure is the area of activation and the centroid of that area of activation, and also the period during which the muscle is activated in this area. And the results are shown here is that we measure the activation duration as a function of the type of intervention that we used during these days of intervention, and we compare that to our control situation. And what we observe is that the proportion of active epoch in the muscle is less for what we call this Jacobson maneuver, which consists in elevating the shoulder with forceful exertion. And what we observe is that also for this Jacobson test and also swinging the arm is where the area of activation was much larger. So if you reduce the amount of activation, and if you increase the area of activation, it means that there is a reduction in muscle activity, but also a defocalization of the muscle activity, meaning that the activity in the muscle is more distributed, meaning that we are successful in disrupting Cinderella. And so this is the benefit of this activity, is that when people have static contraction, is once in a while we can disturb them. And what we were trying to find out is what is the biggest bang for the buck here in order to improve that disruption of activity and make people rest more and activate their muscle differently. So in fact, we fight fatigue with muscle contraction. It appears to be counterintuitive, but this muscle contraction is requiring the central nervous system not to work monotonously, but to change the mode of muscle activation, and that's the best way of doing it. And so finally, to conclude, I say that in fact, this high density EMG allowed us to go inside the muscle and find out what are the mechanisms that we have to fight in this static contraction. And so we showed that there were major differences when we compare, well, I didn't mention the writing and task, so let's skip that. The troop task I didn't mention, but when we compare this interruption strategy, we saw that one was better than the other. So in fact, the take-home message is effectively disruption of monotony that is extremely important. So I would like to thank all my co-authors. This is a collaboration between multiple universities and multiple people. I'm just presenting that. The work was supported by SECO. So you don't know who these guys are. They are different institutions, and you don't see NIOSH because some reviewer at NIOSH said, oh, an R1 should be generalized. And I say, well, that's very strange because generalization, there are a lot of people working in standing, and it has been demonstrated that 50% of the workers in the United States or in Europe stand more than 75% of the time during their work. And some other reviewers said, oh, you know, the money is going to go to all these foreign institutions, so it's not going to benefit our worker. I don't know where it comes from, but you see sometimes reviewers have a very strange idea. But anyway, here I thank all these people that are helping me produce all these papers and all this presentation. Thank you for your attention. So now I can take some questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. At this time, we'd like to open it up to questions from our attendees. If you have a question, you can go ahead and enter it in the Zoom webinar chat or the Q&A box. If there are any questions out there today, please feel free to go ahead and share in that chat box or the Q&A. Oh, there we go. We got our first question. Over a long period of time, would stress from subjective fatigue, ergo mats have been taken away, have an impact on objective measurements?
If the question would be, if somebody is using the mat and then not using the mat, whether there would be an effect. In fact, whether the mat is there or not, we have exactly the same effect. So if somebody is using a mat and we remove the mat, the only effect that we'll observe is dissatisfaction. And I say that shouldn't be a reason. That should be a good reason not to withdraw the mat because there will be dissatisfaction. But in terms of physiological effect, I would expect that if somebody is working on a mat and we remove the mat, the fatigue will be identical.
Thank you. We also have a question regarding shoe inserts. While you've dismissed shoe inserts, what about arch support inserts? Have you found any value in those?
We didn't test the support of the arch. We tested shoes that were different, and we tested sole insert that were not arch. It was just some that was recommended supposedly to be anti-fatigue, and we didn't find. Once again, we didn't test all possible mat, all possible shoes, all possible sole insert, but from a biomechanical point of view, everything that is happening under the feet, lower than the feet, is not going to influence too much the muscle fatigue at the leg level. So far, we haven't seen any efficient interface between the foot and the floor that would reduce the muscle fatigue. But once again, I didn't test them all, so I mentioned what I've tested here. And the
Great.
arch, I didn't know.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Martin. We also have a comment, anti-fatigue mats can serve as insulation against cold surfaces, which is something he's seen while working at benches in a mechanic shop. Can you think of any other potential benefits of mats?
Effectively, there could be insulation. The benefit is the perception, is that people feel that because they have a mat, they feel that the walking on the mat is easier, is less stressful. And I've tried that myself. We have tried that on a basketball court that was a sort of huge mat where people were playing. And effectively, people had a better response to that. However, I would say, when we tested that on a basketball court, we found some beneficial effect because people were performing dynamic tasks and not static tasks. So I say the anti-fatigue mat in a static situation, the major benefit could be insulation due to temperature or satisfaction because of a perception, but the perception may not represent the reality. On a dynamic task such as basketball playing, we found that there was a beneficial effect of this type of floor that were sort of similar to anti-fatigue mat, but it was a dynamic issue, very different from a static issue. So it's again, it's the context in which something is tested that is very important.
Great, thank you very much. We also have a question regarding neck muscle fatigue. They saw that you were basing it on the trapezius.
Mm-hmm.
What about other neck muscles?
It's effectively delicate. Well, we use the trapezius muscle because it's a very large muscle, and a lot of people are affected by trapezius myalgia. So this is why we focused on that one, because it was a priority. And I know that some other muscle, like the splenic or the mastocleido, are also involved in maintaining the head. We didn't test this muscle here. We wanted to test some hypotheses dealing with the static activity and demonstrating on the large muscle using 2D EMG, which is easy to do on the trapezius muscle, that effectively there is something that is happening in the control of the muscle, and that disruption is beneficial. So I'm very sorry I cannot tell you about the other neck muscle, but I can justify why we use that one, the trapezius.
Thank you very much. Someone also had a comment regarding the objective method of measuring aspects of peripheral fatigue versus subjective reports that these can help improve comfort, come from workers on mats, shoe inserts, etc., can be used to help improve comfort.
Effectively, from the subjective point of view, people may immediately after work, people will complain about fatigue or will complain about better reduction of fatigue due to the mat. However, as an ergonomist, I would say use subjective perception when people complain about something that is discomfortable, painful. Never use subjective perception when people don't complain. And I can cite multiple examples that shows that the subjective perception when people don't complain doesn't mean that there is no risk. That's a very important aspect. I'm glad that somebody made that comment. So I would say use subjective perception. If people complain, you know that it's not going to be good. If they don't complain, you need to use the objective method. Those who measured muscle fatigue by subjective perception assume that fatigue had disappeared an hour later, and it's not true.
Thank you very much. We also have another question regarding irregular surfaces, such as saltillo tile versus smooth surfaces in flooring, and how that changes pressure points where a person moves their feet in minor relocations. Is that something that you've looked at in any of your studies?
Not exactly here. We didn't verify the difference between different floor and different bumps here and there. What I would say is that whenever the floor is not even, when there are these bumps, holes everywhere, the activity of the ankle will increase to maintain balance. And so I would expect that there would be more fatigue walking on an uneven floor than walking on a flat floor. So that seems to be obvious because the amount of muscle activity would be greater to maintain balance on uneven floors. Now, we didn't check also inclined floor either. We didn't check stepping. We just use a flat floor because that's where people are mostly standing on. And I would say if people have to stand on a surface, it's better uniform. It's better that the surface is uniform rather than bumpy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And we do have a couple more minutes. If anyone would like to ask another question, you are welcome to enter it into that chat and Q&A. In the meantime, I would love to thank our presenter and everyone who joined us for today's webinar. Our next NIOSH ERC webinar will be a patient handling story from patient migration to repositioning on Wednesday, November 20th with Dr. Kermit Davis from University of Cincinnati Education and Research Center. COEH Continuing Education will also be having a webinar on effective interactive training for workers, and that will be led by Alejandra Domenzen, Program Coordinator with the Labor and Occupational Health Program at UC Berkeley. You can learn more and register for our upcoming webinars at coeh.berkeley.edu. We do have another question that came through. Do you have recommendations for a rest interval for employees working at computers or through microscopes to reduce neck fatigue?
Yes, I guess the major recommendation is disrupting that monotonic activity, is that forcing, people don't like to be forced to do something, but giving incentive so people would move away from their microscope, from their workstation. Every time I go to a place where I see people eating at their workstation, in their office, I say, get out of here, move, you have to move. That's the master word here, is moving and not maintaining that monotony of continuous muscle activity. Now, what is the best alternation of sitting, standing, walking? I would say around 40 minutes to an hour. I would say if people rotate these activities, it would be beneficial. But essentially trying to do something else once in a while, or even if they don't go away, is that changing the neck posture in order to produce a muscle exertion by shrugging the shoulder, elevating their shoulder, doing this type of activity that disrupt the monotony of muscle activity. So that these are the recommendations, is make your muscle move in one way or another.
Thank you very much. We also have another question on whether you are able to point to any studies on correlation between force handled and fatigue.
Between force and fatigue. Yes, in fact, I could point to some studies, but there is one word that I didn't understand, is what force? Force handled?
Yes, it says between force handled and fatigue.
So it would be a lifting task. There are a lot of studies dealing with the lifting task, and in fact, the NIOSH lifting guide is trying to address that, is what is the maximum weight that can be lifted as a function of the condition in which the lift is performed. So if you refer to NIOSH and the NIOSH lifting guide, you would find a lot of justification that are based on fatigue, based on energy consumption, metabolism, biomechanics as well, and physiology. And effectively, there are studies there. But if you look at the amount of force that is produced by just gripping an object, there are also a lot of studies that are performed, and including mine. We have done some of these studies, especially when handling hand tools, showing that there is effectively muscle fatigue induced by hand tool manipulation. But if it's about lifting, I would say the NIOSH lifting guide would be the first source of information.
Great, thank you. And we do have one final question. Do you have any prevention recommendations or techniques employees can use to reduce muscle fatigue from their static postures?
And that's exactly, I mean, the question is sort of answered here, is that disruption of this static posture. And in fact, where people are standing all day long, is recommending while they are standing to sort of elevate their body by stepping on their toes, for example, changing the muscle contraction, shaking their legs, doing that once in a while in order to disrupt that monotony. Of course, taking advantage of the rest break to go do something else, walk around and then come back to the workstation, taking the advantage of a dynamic aspect. And I would say it's not a dynamic aspect in terms of doing another low-level muscle exertion, such as walking at a slow pace. I would say it's a dynamic exertion that requires some forceful exertion as well, because that modifies the pattern of the way in which we control the muscle, and that would be disrupting that Cinderella type of muscle fiber that are continuously working and leading to this fatigue and disorder phenomena.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Martin, for joining us. We really appreciate it. You can learn more about upcoming webinars and events, including the NIOSH Ergonomics series, online at coeh.berkeley.edu. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find a recording of this webinar, as well as our other webinars with this series. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Are you still there?
Yes, we are.
Well, just to tell you is that if people want to ask me questions also by email, they can be free to ask me.
Great, thank you. Yes, if you have any follow-up questions, please do feel free to reach out to Dr. Martin. Thank you all so much for joining us.